It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to share Torah with you this evening in preparation for Pesach. So thank you so much for YCT organizing the program and for all the institutional sponsors. The topic I want to approach is one which I'm dedicating this year in honor of my older brother, Benjamin Margulies, who always asks this question at our family Sedarim, and I felt that it was appropriate to take a time to probe it more in depth and explore several solutions to the problem. And the problem is that the Rasha, the wicked child, is one who I think we treat rather unfairly in the Seder. And I think now, you might say, oh, it's Chovevei, he's going to be radical, he's going to say something controversial. But in fact, I think what we're going to arrive at this evening is the original intention of the Midrash about the Rasha, the wicked child. It's not a radical new interpretation. This is, in fact, bringing back what the text originally was supposed to mean before the Rasha was unfairly maligned. And so I want to try to quickly run through 7 different pieces of information that will hopefully enrich and deepen our understanding of this character throughout our traditional texts, running from the original biblical text of Psukim in the Torah, and some from Navi, from the prophets as well, getting into the Midrashic discussion of the Rasha, the wicked child, and then some Talmudic sources and later rabbinic commentaries as well. If we take a look at the verses, the Psukim in Shemot, Parak Yudbet, chapter 12, we see that the original context for the question which the Midrash later ascribes to the wicked child, the Rasha, is your children will ask you about what you're doing. Why are you celebrating Pesach? Why are you bringing the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice? And it says, when your children say to you, what is this service to you? And a beautiful insight into this, I actually just was taught this past week by one of my students, high school students, who pointed out that if we really carefully read this, this isn't a rude comment. This isn't a harsh question. This question is asking about deeper meaning. Maha avodah hazot lachem. What does it mean to you? And if we compare that question to the question which is traditionally associated with the chacham, the wise child wants to know content. The wise child wants to know what are the laws. But the so-called wicked child wants not just content, but understanding. They want a deeper understanding of the meaning behind the performance of the mitzvot. If anything, the pedagogues among us, the educators among us know this is a much higher level learner. This is someone who's interested in making meaning out of what they learn, and obviously is much more appropriate, much more important level of understanding that we hope to cultivate in our children, in our students, and in our family and friends at the Seder. And okay, so they asked a good question, but then we see the answer that the parent is supposed to give to the Rasha, so-called wicked child, is Ve'amartem, you should say to them, Zevach Pesach hu l'Adonai asher Pasach al batei v'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. It is the Paschal, I hear translated barbecue, because I like to be precise with the word Zevach. But it's a Paschal sacrifice to Hashem, who protected the homes of the Israelites when in Egypt. And so again, the question is not a harsh question, and the answer is not a harsh answer in the text of the Psukim, in the text of the Torah. The child is asking for information, for meaning about why we're performing these rituals, and the answer given is to explain why we're doing it is as a remembrance of how God protected us in Egypt. If we compare this to the answer that is given not in the Torah, but in the Midrash, in the Haggadah, to the wicked child, again, we should see that the answer is not, in its original context, harsh at all. This is here about a child needs to be taught about why we're celebrating Pesach, here in Shemot Parak Yud Gimel, Exodus chapter 13. And the Torah tells us, V'higadta levincha bayom hahu lemor, you should tell your child on that day, ba'avur zeh, it is because of this, asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mitzrayim, that God did for me, that Adonai did for me when I left Egypt. And again, until we start emphasizing the word li for me and reading a lot into that, in its plain meaning, this is a beautiful answer. Of course, this is an answer that says the reason we're celebrating this holiday, the reason we're bringing this sacrifice is to commemorate what Hashem did for us as we left Egypt. Just as a tangent, It's a tangent that's been on my mind the past few years, maybe, and so I wanted to share it, even though it's not associated with what we're learning tonight. But sometimes Torah has to get out into the world. The mitzvah of tefillin that appears here in Shemot Perek Yud Gimel, Exodus chapter 13, we wonder what is the connection in the Torah between the mitzvah of tefillin and the Exodus from Egypt. If you look at the picture here below, this is from the funerary mask of Tutankhamun, one of the New Kingdom pharaohs of Egypt. You see that the ancient pharaohs of Egypt used to wear on their royal headdress a symbol of the vulture, Nephbet, and a symbol of the snake, Wajet, who were supposedly the Egyptian idolatrous protectors of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, respectively. And so if we think about the symbolism of leaving the rule of the Egyptian pharaoh, what better way to show that we are in charge of our own destiny and the rulers of our own nation than to put something on our forehead symbolic not of the idols of Egypt, but of our dedication to the one true God. Let's move now to the Midrash Mechilta. This is the source that's quoted in our Haggadah for the Midrash of the four children: the Chacham, the Rasha, the Tam, and Sheino Yodea Lishol, the wise child, the wicked child, the simple child, and the child who does not know how to ask. A well-known text, of course, because it appears in the Haggadah, but I'd like to emphasize, as maybe is not always apparent to every reader of the Haggadah, this text is a midrash. It's an interpretation of a variety of texts from the Torah that quotes psukim, quotes the verses of the Torah, takes them out of context and interprets them in a particular way for a particular purpose. We saw the verses that are used to illustrate the Rasha, the wicked child. And here you can see now a little bit better, hopefully, how the text takes the plain sense meaning of the verses and, I hate to use this word, but distorts the meaning with rabbinic interpretation. That is, what is it that the Rasha, the wicked child, says? Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. What is this service to you? And of course, in the original context, this, as I said, is asking for meaning, asking for a deeper sense of what is the reason behind the performance of the mitzvah. And here, the author of the Midrash, the rabbis who authored this Midrash, say, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem, lachem, to you, vilolo, and not to himself. That is, this person, this child asking the question, is asking, what are you doing it for, not what are we doing it for? So here I like to pause and point out, what are the four primary characteristics of the comment of the Rasha, so-called Rasha, that leads the rabbis to interpret the verse this way? Why do they assume that this child is, in fact, the wicked child, as opposed to any other characteristic? So the first one, of course, as the Midrash highlights for us, is the use of the word lachem. Lachem meaning to you, and at least in other contexts, it may be that the wise child's question is punctuated not with the word lachem, to you, but otanu, to us. There's a little bit of variation there. We'll have to discuss that another time. Another detail which is picked up by the Talmud Yerushalmi in its parallel version to this Midrash is that the word avodah, of course, in its plain sense, the word avodah means a service, worship of God, but it could be interpreted as well as servitude, slavery, oppressive work. And so the Talmud Yerushalmi here uses the word torah, hard work, to describe this service. The child thinks that the preparations for the holiday or the performance of the mitzvot are too burdensome. The third detail, I have to scroll up here briefly to point it out, is that whereas the simple child and the wise child are introduced in the Torah with the word yisha'alacha, they will ask, or tish'al will ask, the so-called wicked child introduces their comment. It's a comment, not a question, with the word ki yomiru aleichem, they will say to you. Perhaps the rabbis interpret this is a confrontational child who's trying to make a point at the Seder, not necessarily asking a legitimate question, seeking the answer. And the fourth detail, which the rabbis are picking up on to characterize this character as the Rasha, is the absence of a mention of God. Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. What is the purpose of this service to you? But they don't mention God, as opposed to the Chacham, the wise child, who mentions God explicitly in their question. So we understand why the authors of the Midrash would pick up on those details to say that this is a wicked child, that is, confrontational child, perhaps. They introduce their question as a statement, Yomeru, not asking a question. They direct it in the second person to the person they're asking, rather than including themselves in the group, explicitly using the first person. They don't mention God, and they use the word avodah, which could be read as a characterization of the mitzvot as a burden. Okay, now let's look at actually how the authors of the Midrash characterize the appropriate response, or how to then move ahead with this sort of child. Because again, the answer is not to just totally brush them aside, as we'll see. There's a more subtle point being communicated here, which I think is very important to emphasize. So if we look at how the Midrash gives instructions to the parents in response to this child, what does it say? Lefi shehotzi et atzmo min hakilal. And usually, if you look in your Haggadah, this will be translated as hotzi et atzmo, he took himself out, min hakilal, from the community, from the group. And of course, that's a perfectly legitimate translation. It's a very commonplace translation. And I wouldn't say it's far from the meaning of the words themselves, but I would offer an alternative. If you know modern Hebrew, you know the phrase yotzei min haklal. Yotzei min haklal means that someone is unusual. There is the klal, the general group, the general rule, and they are yotzei min haklal. They are somehow different than the norm. Now, of course, that can be a good thing. Someone can be exceptionally talented, exceptionally charismatic, exceptionally energetic, or someone could be exceptional in a negative way. Hotzi et atzmo min haklal could just mean, this idiom existed in Rabbinic Hebrew as well, it could just mean the child is acting unusually. It could mean, like our Haggadah translated, that the person actively is excluding themselves from the community. But before we jump to that, it might just be that this child is a little bit more confrontational, a little bit more troubled. Not so much of a problem. As we'll see later, of course, this child is still at the Seder. And what is the appropriate response to that unusual action? And here is again a point which the subtleties of the Hebrew language, unfortunately, make difficult for people whose native language is English. And the answer that the Midrash suggests that the parent give to this Ben Rasha, to the wicked child, is hakhe et shinav. Hakhe et shinav. If you look here, you see a picture of unripe green grapes. And I want to show you Sukkim verses from the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel, Ezekiel. Both of them reference an idiom which was commonplace in First Temple Israelite society, which is as follows: Avot achlu voser, if the parents eat sour grapes, unripe grapes, v'shinei banim tikhena, won't the children's teeth be tikhena? So this word is not from the shoresh nun kaf he, to hit, as many people mistakenly assume. Hakeh et shinav, hit him in the teeth. That's not what it's saying. Hakeh et shinav, from the shoresh kuf he, means the sensation you feel on your teeth when you eat unripe grapes. If anyone has ever eaten unripe grapes, you know, very astringent, very sour. It makes you go. In the idiomatic meaning of this phrase as it appears in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, and Yechezkel, Ezekiel, it means that a person feels the consequences of their actions. As Jeremiah says, Kol ha'adam ha'ochel ha'boser tikena shinav. Whoever eats the sour grapes, their teeth should feel that feeling. And so the sensation of consequences for a person's actions are appropriate. So if we look back at the text of the Midrash, what are the parents supposed to do? Af ata, since this person acted in an unusual way, or perhaps even separated themselves from the community, what is the appropriate response? Af ata, so to you, you should do the same thing. Hakeh et shinav, let this child taste the appropriate consequences for their actions. Ve'emor lo, and say to him, Ba'avur zeh, it is because of this, asa Adonai li betzeti mimitzrayim, li velo lach, to me and not to you. So just like the child phrased their question in the second person, seemingly distancing themselves from their audience, here too, the parents are supposed to emphasize themselves, li, it was for me and not for you. Do they really mean to totally exclude the child? I don't think so. I think it's meant to be a verbal barb. This is a little bit of a rough conversation, but it's saying, if that's how you're going to speak to me, then I'm going to shoot it back at you. Tit for tat. And so now another detail, again, of this original text of the Midrash that I'll draw your attention to, compare it to your Haggadah at home, is that many modern Haggadot for this phrase have li velo lo, to me and not to him, for me and not for him. But in the original, it's in the second person, li velo lecha, to me and not to you. The parent is directly addressing in the second person the child, as opposed to in the modern Haggadah where it's phrased in the third person, the parent is talking about the child, which is very rude, with them seated at the table speaking about them in the third person. He isn't part of our group. No, it's saying, if this is your attitude, you're not part of the group. You need to understand what are going to be the consequences of that attitude. And that, I think, is a much more responsive and appropriate response, which is to say, you're going to treat me this way, I'm going to treat you like this. If you're going to act in this way, there are going to be consequences. It's fair, it's appropriate, it's measured. Here, just so you can see that I'm not lying about the verb roots, the difference between the verb naka, to smite, to hit, to inflict injury, and kaha, to blunt or dull, which, as the Brown Driver Briggs dictionary points out here, appears in the Tanakh primarily as about the sensation on the teeth. Okay. And now I want to point to our last two different approaches to this question of the Rasha, the wicked child. And that is, okay, even let's grant that maybe this is a wicked child. What's the appropriate response nonetheless, if you have a wicked child, at your Seder? So first, let's take a look, at the Talmud from Masechet Nazir. This is where the title came from, that it was Daf Yomi to the rescue, because for those who've been studying the Daf Yomi is now in Masechet Nazir, a very rarely studied tractate. And so we have a chance to see some Gemaras that maybe we wouldn't always get to see. So the Talmud says as follows: Amar Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba Bar Chana quotes his teacher Rabbi Yochanan, a second generation rabbi of the Amoraim from the land of Israel. Mai dichtiv ki yesharim darchei Hashem v'tzadikim yelechu bam uposhiim yikashilu bam. What does it mean, the verse in the Navi Hosea, that the paths of God are straight, the just, yesharim, upright people, tzadikim yelechu bam, just people can walk on those paths, but transgressors, poshiim, stumble over them. So the assumption being made here in the Talmud is that it must be that a single path, one path, can lead a righteous person to walk successfully, but will cause a wicked person to stumble. So Rabbi Yochanan gives the following example. Mashal, he illustrates it using a parable. Lishnei bnei adam shetzalu et pischeihem, two people who each were roasting their Pesach sacrifice. Echad achalo l'shum mitzvah, one ate it in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Ve'echad achalo l'shum achila gasa, and the other ate the Passover sacrifice just for gluttonous eating. He really felt like roast lamb that night. Zeh she'achalo l'shum mitzvah, the one who ate it to perform the mitzvah, the verse states about him, Betzadikim yelechu bam, that righteous people will successfully walk through the paths of God. Vezeh she'achalo l'shum achila gasa, and the one who ate it for gluttonous eating, uposhiim yikashilu bam, has instead stumbled in God's path by fulfilling the mitzvah in an inappropriate way, has failed the task. So even the same action can, for one person, be successfully walking in God's path, and for another person, stumbling. And Reish Lakish, the decades-long friend and interlocutor of Rabbi Yochanan responds. We know that Reish Lakish had a bit of a colored past. Reish Lakish was a highwayman. Reish Lakish was somewhat violent in his past. Rabbi Yochanan, unfortunately, broke their relationship by referencing that in a heated moment. Reish Lakish responds to Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, Amar le Reish Lakish, hi, Rasha, karit le, you are calling this person a Rasha, a wicked person? Nehi lo ka'av mitzvah min hamuvchar. Fine, he didn't perform the mitzvah in the most ideal way. Pesach mi'akavid, but he successfully did the mitzvah. I think it's impossible to read this Gemara in Nazir without thinking of the Rasha at the Seder in the Haggadah. You have two people offering their Korban Pesach, their Passover sacrifice, and one did it correctly, perfect, and the other did it less than optimally. You're going to call that person a Rasha, says Reish Lakish? Okay, maybe it was Achila Gasa, it was gluttonous eating. He's still eating the Korban Pesach. He's still in Jerusalem for the holiday with his family. Think about our Rasha at the Seder. The Rasha in our Haggadah is at the Seder, asks a question, asks a sophisticated, intelligent question. Okay, maybe they asked it with a little bit of a bad attitude. Maybe they used not the best words to articulate their point. Reish Lakish comes to the defense of the Rasha and says, Rasha, karit le, you're going to call this person a wicked person, a Rasha, a sinner? This person is doing the mitzvah. Let's give them credit where credit is due and not judge them unfairly. I think it's a beautiful interpretation. I learned it from Facebook. I forget whose post I saw it on, so I have to give anonymous attribution. But I can never read the Haggadah the same way again after having learned this passage from the Talmud. In other words, when you think about the Rasha, okay, we use the word Rasha. Maybe that's unfair. We think about the ways in which this person has fallen short. Maybe we should be thinking more about the ways this person has been successful. And with that, I want to move down to a comment from the Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai from the 18th century, quoting an Italian rabbi, Rabbi Yeshaya Detrani of the 13th century in one of his comments on the Torah. A rather unusual comment, perhaps based entirely on a scribal error, but the Chida quotes it nonetheless. And the Chida here says, quoting from the Reed, Rabbi Yeshaya Detrani, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem, what is this service to you? From Shemot Perek Yudbet, Exodus chapter 12. Vehu onelo, how should you answer him? Ein maftirin achar ha'pesach afikoman, that we do not eat afikoman after the Passover sacrifice, which, if you've been paying attention to your Haggadah, you should know is the answer that we are supposed to give, not to the Rasha, the wicked child, but to the Ben Chacham, to the wise child. And here the Rid notes, what is he asking him? And what is he answering him? It doesn't make sense. If the Rasha is wicked and he's asking this question that excludes himself from the group, why are you giving him an answer that's just teaching him the halachot of Pesach, the laws of Pesach, just like you would teach the Chacham, the wise child? And so the Rid suggests, V'yesh lomar, it's possible to say, Af al gav de'hai inish rashahu, even though this person is a Rasha. Yeah, they have a bad streak. They have an attitude. They're acting up a little bit. Bechochma shoel, the person asked a question of sophistication, of intelligence. He asked, as my brother always likes to say, basically the same question as the Chacham. That is, so if they ask the question the same as the Chacham, they should get the same answer as the Chacham. Wise question gets a wise answer, regardless of whether it's coming from an innocent perspective or maybe a little bit more colored perspective, a little bit more wicked perspective. Nonetheless, the child deserves a good answer. Okay, so that's the Chida quoting from Rabbi Yeshaya Detrani. Like I said, traditional sources going back to the Middle Ages, all good stuff. And to close, as our seventh perspective here on maybe we deserve to give the Rasha a little bit more benefit of the doubt and a little bit more compassion. a letter from 1957 from Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson of Lubavitch, which he addressed to all of the Chabad Hasidim throughout the world, and which is studied and repeated regularly since that time, because it articulates a message which I think many of us will recognize as characteristic of the Chabad Lubavitch movement in their outreach efforts. Obviously, this sort of attitude is not limited to followers of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, but should inspire and enrich the lives of every Jew who can share it with others. And Rabbi Schneerson says as follows: "L'tzad hashoni shel arbat habanim." What are the differences between the four children? The ways in which they differ one from another. Yesh lahem tzad hashava. They have a common feature, common characteristic. Shutafut. They all participate. In what sense? Lubavitch Rebbe says, "Afilu harasha sharui gam kein ba'avodat haseder." Even the wicked child is invested in the service of the Seder. That is, all four of these children are present at the Seder. The Chacham, the wise child, of course, we would expect to be there. The Tam, we would hope would be there. Maybe they're not at the most sophisticated or they're not most mature yet. That's okay. She'eino yodea lish'ol could be someone totally distanced from Jewish observance, Jewish practice, understanding of the rituals, and nonetheless, they come. They got an invitation from a friend, a family member. They feel welcome, and they attend. And the Rasha even feels distant, pushed apart, isolated, excluded, but they showed up. They brought the macaroons, they brought a bottle of wine, I don't know, but they're there. So Lubavitcher Rebbe says, "Hu nifgash v'chai b'yachad im uvdei ha'avodah." The Rasha, the wicked child, is present here with the people who are observing the mitzvot, who are performing the service. Im chayei Torah mitzvot v'hu mit'anyein bahem. He lives among those who practice the service with a life of Torah mitzvot and is interested in them. That is, takes the time and invests the energy to participate. Davar zeh notein tikva. This gives us hope. Betikva chazaka beyoter, very strong hope. Shelo rak hatam v'hashe'ino yodea lish'ol, not just the simple child and the child who does not know how to ask. Elagam harasha, even the wicked child as well. Yiyu chachamim. Our hope is that all children in our communities and adult children as well, every Jew has the potential to study Torah, to invest in mitzvot, to perform mitzvot, to include others in their communities. As we say in our tefillot, ten chalkeinu b'toratecha, give us our portion in your Torah, because every member of our community has their own voice to share in the conversation of Torah. We hope that everyone will be chachamim, everyone will be well educated, everyone will be invested, everyone will perform mitzvot, and not just the simple one or the one who doesn't know how to ask, but the Rasha as well. Even those who currently feel distanced, who currently feel excluded, will be welcome to join the community, join the conversation with their unique perspective and their unique attitudes. And he says, it pains us, it's very difficult. Certainly in our times, he's writing in 1957, the darkness is doubled and redoubled. There's so much assimilation, there's so much lack of a Torah education or availability of the resources to perform mitzvot or Jewish communities for people to access. There is another type of child we have to worry about, the child who doesn't even attend a Seder at all. Now, thank God, we should say the Seder is perhaps the most observed Jewish ritual throughout the world. Maybe not everyone observes their Seder exactly according to the dictates of halacha, but the Jewish people know that Pesach is important, and Jewish people know that they should be participating, at least many of us. And there are those of us who still need to be invited back and who still need to find a way to someone's table. So we all have a responsibility, those of us who are hosting Sedarim or being hosted at Sedarim, to make sure other Jews feel welcome, other Jews feel invited, other Jews feel that they have the opportunity to share their voice, to study Torah, to perform mitzvot along with us. And as the rabbi from Lubavitch says, Hu eino shoel kushiyot, the child who doesn't attend the Seder at all, of course doesn't ask a question, not because they don't know how or because they're unable to articulate them, but because they don't even have the opportunity at all. And he says, this person grows up without any connection to their Judaism, as opposed to the Rasha. The Rasha is at the Seder. The Rasha asks a question with chokhmah, with intelligence. They have a good education. They have a background. They have a connection. Maybe it's rocky. Maybe it's strained. We need to do work on that too. But let's remember that this is actually a success story. This is a child who, okay, they're using their intelligence and their education to push a little bit, and there needs to be room for pushing, and we need to find the right ways to incorporate their perspectives into the conversation of Torah and to make them feel welcome and included. So these are all 7 different points I wanted to share about the Rasha, the wicked child, and I know it's a lot of information, so if there are people who have any questions, I think Rabbi Berman is going to share them with me now so that I'll do my best to answer in the remaining time.
Thank you, Rabbi Margulies. Just a reminder, there will be a recording in about a week's time on the YC website, as I mentioned. Also, Rabbi Margulies, there was a request for your source sheet. Perhaps you'll feel comfortable sharing that at some point. I want to open it up. I know we have about 1 minute until Rabbi Cole Feingold will be on with us. So does anybody want to ask one question? You could just throw it in the chat or speak up, and whoever asks first will be the winner of the question. And hopefully Rabbi Margulies can answer it in 1 minute's time. And if you don't want to ask a question, which we are, of course, we're all about asking questions. If you don't want to ask it now, you're welcome to put it in the chat. Even if we don't answer it together, perhaps we can all benefit just from the questions themselves and work at our own Seders to answer them. Thank you, Rabbi Margulies, for the source sheet. Rabbi Abramson from the chat. There it is for you, as well as for everybody else. We'll give it just a minute, or let's see here, 15 seconds before we formally introduce Rabbi Rochel Cole Feingold to make sure that everybody who wants to be here is able to be here. So stay tuned.
Hello?
Hi, is that Rabbi Epstein? I know that voice.
Thank you so much. So basically, just to repeat, a lot of Haggadot have a mistranslation, you're saying, for knocking out his teeth? Like in the notes, it's a mistranslation or a different translation?
So I think what happened is that the words blunt his teeth is a literal translation of hakhe et shinav with the shorish kuf pei hey, but many people unfortunately understand that or hear that and think it means hit him in the teeth because of the similarity to the word lehakot, to hit in Hebrew. But hakhe et shinav means literally to let his teeth have the sensation of eating bitter sour grapes. And as we see from the psukim in Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, it means idiomatically to let the child taste the consequences for their actions. It doesn't mean any violent outbursts should be taking place at the dinner table. The person asked me, should the person have the choice whether to attend or not? I assume this is a question about people who maybe feel distanced from Judaism. Should they have the choice? Of course, every person has the freedom to choose how to act. But those of us who think that the Pesach Seder is important, those of us who think studying Torah and doing mitzvot are important, and feeling connected to the Jewish community, I think, have a responsibility to ensure that we're sharing that with others and inviting others to feel welcome to join us, to feel that they're not just being welcomed in as a guest, but they're being welcomed in as equal partners. Like I said, Ten Chalkeinu B'Toratecha means each Jew, each person in our community has a portion of Torah, has their own perspective to share in the grand dialogue of the study of Torah and of our nation as a whole. And that means we hope that every person chooses to join us, and we hope that every person brings their unique perspective to that conversation.